The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of returning travelers, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I spotted my wife walking through the arrival gate. Vanessa wasn't alone. She had her arm wrapped around another man's waist, laughing at something he whispered in her ear, while an older couple walked beside them, carrying shopping bags with luxury brand names splashed across them. My heart didn't just break in that moment. It shattered into 1,000 pieces and then reassembled itself into something cold, something calculating, something that knew exactly what needed to be done. I had suspected something was wrong when she insisted on going to Dubai alone for what she called a business conference, but seeing her return with her lover and his family made every suspicion I'd buried come roaring back to life. The billionaire wife I had built an empire with, the woman I had trusted with everything, had just walked back into my life with the man she'd been betraying me with, and they looked happy, comfortable, like they'd been a family for years. I stood frozen in the shadows, watching her touch his face with the same tenderness she used to show me, watching his parents beam at her, like she was already their daughter-in-law, watching the four of them move through the terminal like they owned the world. Every laugh that escaped her lips felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest, but I didn't move, didn't react, didn't give away my presence, because I needed to see this, needed to let this image burn into my memory so I would never second guess what I was about to do to her. I stood there in the shadows of the terminal, watching them collect their luggage from the carousel, my phone buzzing in my pocket with messages I'd programmed to send automatically. While Vanessa had been sipping champagne at 30,000 feet and holding hands with her lover, I had been systematically dismantling everything we'd built together. The penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, sold to a tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley 3 days ago for $8 million, and the closing papers had been signed and processed before her plane even touched down on American soil. The vacation home in Martha's Vineyard where we'd spent our 5th anniversary. Gone to a retired couple from Boston who paid cash and took immediate possession, probably already redecorating the bedroom, where Vanessa and I had once promised each other forever. The investment portfolio would spend 15 years building, the stocks and bonds and mutual funds that represented our financial security. Liquidated in a flurry of trades that my broker questioned but executed anyway, because I was their primary account holder and had every legal right to make those decisions. Every shared asset, every joint investment, every piece of property that had both our names on it had been converted to cash and moved beyond her reach, transferred to offshore accounts and trust funds that even the best forensic accountants would struggle to trace. I had spent the last 2 weeks working with the best attorneys money could buy, men and women who specialized in high net worth divorces and knew exactly how to exploit every loophole in our prenuptial agreement. Using every piece of leverage I had accumulated over our marriage to ensure that when the dust settled, Vanessa would be left with nothing but her clothes and her memory. The plan had started forming the moment I found the text messages on her iPad 2 months ago, in early November when the Chicago winter was just beginning to bite. She'd been careless, leaving it on the kitchen counter while she showered after one of her supposed workout sessions, and curiosity had gotten the better of me when I saw a notification from someone named Darnell with a heart emoji next to his name, a name I'd never heard her mention in all our years together. The messages had been explicit, detailing not just their affair, but their plans for a future together, trips they wanted to take to places I'd always promised to show her, dreams they wanted to chase using money that came from my sleepless nights and endless sacrifices, all funded by the wealth I'd worked day and night to accumulate from nothing. Darnell worked as a personal trainer at an upscale gym in downtown Chicago, the same gym where Vanessa had claimed she was getting back in shape for her health, and had encouraged her, even paid for the expensive membership and the sessions with him because I wanted her to be happy. He came from a working-class family on the South Side, and from what I could gather from their conversations, his parents had been thrilled when their son started dating a wealthy woman who could elevate their status and give them access to a lifestyle they'd only dreamed about. Vanessa had apparently been showering them with gifts, paying for their vacations, even covering the mortgage on their modest home in Bronzeville, and all of it had been done with our money, with funds she'd transferred from our joint accounts while I was busy working 18-hour days to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to and now wanted to share with someone else. I watched as Darnell's father helped load their suitcases onto a luggage cart, his face bright with the kind of joy that comes from being treated like royalty, probably still riding the high of first-class flights and five-star hotels in Dubai. His mother had her arm linked with Vanessa's, chatting animatedly about something, and I could see the diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the fluorescent lights of the terminal, a bracelet I recognized because I bought something similar for Vanessa on our 10th anniversary. The betrayal wasn't just that she'd found someone else. It was that she'd brought his entire family into our wealth, shared our resources with people who had no claim to what I'd built, treated them to experiences that should have been ours alone. Darnell himself looked exactly like his pictures from social media, tall and athletic, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from youth and physical attractiveness, probably 15 years younger than me, definitely more exciting than a 45-year-old businessman who spent most of his time in meetings and reading financial reports. He had his hand on the small of Vanessa's back, guiding her through the crowd with a possessiveness that made my blood boil, acting like she belonged to him, like he had any right to touch a woman who was still legally my wife. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, documentation that my lawyers had insisted I gather, evidence that would make the divorce proceedings swift and decisive, proof that would destroy any claim she might make to sympathy or reconciliation. They headed toward the exit, pulling their designer luggage behind them, completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing less than 50 feet away, watching their happy reunion fall apart before it even began. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my lead attorney confirming that the final transfers had been completed and all assets were now secured beyond Vanessa's legal reach. I typed back a simple response. She just landed. Let the games begin. Then I followed them out into the cold January night, watching as they piled into a black SUV that Darnell had apparently arranged, probably using money Vanessa had given him from our accounts. As their vehicle pulled away from the curb, I climbed into my own car, a rental they wouldn't recognize, and followed at a safe distance. They were heading back to what Vanessa thought was still our home, the penthouse that no longer belonged to either of us, where a very different kind of welcome was waiting. I had timed everything perfectly, coordinated every detail, so that the moment she walked through that door, reality would come crashing down on her like a ton of bricks. The billionaire wife, who had returned from a trip with her lover, and his family was about to discover that her husband had sold all their assets. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare I had carefully constructed for her betrayal. If you're hooked and want to see what happens when Vanessa walks through that door, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to get even more intense. Drop a comment below telling me what you would do in this situation. Would you forgive or would you make them pay? Let me know, and I'll see you in next chapter. The drive back to the penthouse took 40 minutes through Chicago's late night. Traffic watched from 3 cars behind as Vanessa and her new family laughed and talked in their SUV, completely unaware that their celebration was about to turn into a funeral. I kept my distance, professional and careful, the way I'd learned to be in business negotiations, where one wrong move could cost millions. Except this time, what I stood to lose wasn't money, but my dignity, and I'd already decided that wasn't going to happen. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles had gone pale, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe, to stay calm, to stick to the plan I spent 2 months perfecting, because acting on emotion now would only give Vanessa ammunition to use against me later. The rental car's heater blasted warm air that did nothing to thaw the ice that had formed around my heart, and I found myself thinking about all the years we'd spent together, all the promises we'd made, all the dreams we'd shared, and wondering at what exact moment she'd decided that none of it mattered anymore. She'd thrown away 15 years of marriage for a personal trainer with good abs and empty promises, traded a partnership built on trust and shared sacrifice for passion with a man who probably couldn't even spell portfolio, let alone build one. And the worst part was that she'd done it all behind my back while smiling to my face every single morning. They pulled into the underground parking garage of our building, using the access code that Vanessa still thought was valid, not knowing that I'd already arranged with building management to have all her codes and keys deactivated the moment her flight landed on American soil. I parked across the street and watched through the garage entrance as they unloaded their luggage, Daniel playing the gentleman by handling the heavy bags while his parents marveled at the luxury of the building with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers even in the parking area. Vanessa led them to the private elevator that went directly to our penthouse, the one that required both a key card and a fingerprint scan, and I watched her confidence falter for just a moment when her key card didn't work on the first try. She tried again, probably thinking it was just a technical glitch. And when it failed a second time, I saw her pull out her phone and start dialing, most likely calling me to ask what was going on, why her access wasn't working, completely unprepared for the conversation we were about to have. I didn't answer, just watched as confusion crossed her face as she tried to explain to Daniel and his parents that there must be some kind of mistake, that this had never happened before, that she'd call building management to sort it out. But building management wasn't going to help her because they'd already been paid handsomely to follow my instructions to the letter, and those instructions were very clear about what should happen when Vanessa tried to access a property she no longer had any legal right to enter. I gave them 5 more minutes to struggle with the elevator, watching Vanessa's embarrassment grow as she tried to maintain her composure in front of Daniel's parents, before I finally called her. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with frustration and confusion, asking me where I was and why her access to the building wasn't working, still trying to play the role of a concerned wife who just needed her husband's help with a minor inconvenience. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, savoring the last moment before everything changed, before the life she thought she still had came crashing down around her ears. Then I spoke, my voice calm and cold and completely devoid of the emotion that was churning in my gut, telling her that her access wasn't working because she no longer lived there, because the penthouse had been sold, because everything we'd owned together was gone. The silence on her end was absolute, the kind of silence that comes from complete shock from a brain trying to process information that doesn't make any sense, from a reality that had just shifted so dramatically that she couldn't find words to respond. I could hear Darnell in the background asking what was wrong, could hear the concern in his voice as he realized something was seriously off, could imagine Vanessa's face going pale as the implications of my words started to sink in. She finally found her voice, asking me what I was talking about, insisting that I must be joking, demanding to know what was really going on, because this couldn't be happening. Not now, not after everything. I told her I'd found the messages on her iPad 2 months ago, told her I knew about Daniel, knew about the affair, knew about the trips and the gifts and the mortgage payments she'd been making to his parents using our joint account. I told her that while she'd been in Dubai playing house with her lover and his family, I'd been liquidating every asset we had, selling every property, emptying every account, making sure that when she came back from her little vacation, there would be nothing left for her to come back to. The sound she made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, a noise of pure devastation that under different circumstances might have made me feel guilty, but right now only made me feel satisfied, vindicated, powerful in a way I hadn't felt since I discovered her betrayal. She started to argue, saying I couldn't do this, that it was illegal, that she had rights and lawyers and ways to fight back, but I cut her off with the cold, hard facts that my attorneys had prepared me to deliver. Our prenuptial agreement was ironclad. I was the primary earner and account holder on almost everything, and the few assets that were truly joint had been dealt with in ways that gave her no legal recourse, at least not any recourse that wouldn't take years in court and cost more money than she currently had access to, which was exactly $0. Vanessa's voice cracked as she begged me to stop, to think about what I was doing, to remember all the years we'd spent together and all the love we'd shared, suddenly wanting to reminisce about our marriage now that she realized what it was worth in material terms. I could hear Darnell getting agitated, demanding to know who she was talking to, what was being said, probably starting to realize that his meal ticket was evaporating right before his eyes. I told Vanessa that she had 2 choices. She could spend the night in a hotel with her new family and deal with the divorce papers that would be served to her in the morning. Or she could try to force her way into a building where she no longer had any legal right to be and get arrested for trespassing, which would make the divorce proceedings even messier and more public than they were already going to be. Then I told her the address of the hotel where I'd reserved a room in her name, a budget motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the nightly rate was less than what she usually spent on lunch, just to make sure she understood exactly how far she'd fallen in the span of one phone call. I ended the conversation by saying that if she wanted to know why I'd done this, she should ask Daniel about the text message he'd sent her 3 weeks ago. The one where he'd called me a fool and said he couldn't wait until she divorced me so they could live off my money together. The message that had been the final nail in the coffin of any mercy I might have considered showing her. This story is getting real, and we're just getting started. If you want to find out how Vanessa reacts and what happens next, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss chapter 3. Comment below and tell me, did he go too far, or is this exactly what she deserves? Your thoughts fuel this story, so let me hear them. The next morning, I woke up in my new apartment, a sleek 2-bedroom unit in a luxury high-rise in the Gold Coast that Vanessa didn't know existed, paid for entirely with funds from accounts I'd established long before I discovered her betrayal. The January sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting light on furniture I'd carefully selected over the past month, each piece representing a fresh start, a life without the woman who'd thrown away everything we'd built for a personal trainer, with washboard abs and empty promises. My phone had been buzzing non-stop since midnight, calls and texts from Vanessa that progressed from angry to desperate to pleading, each message more pathetic than the last as reality continued to sink in, and she realized just how thoroughly I dismantled her comfortable existence. I'd ignored every single one, letting her messages pile up unread, because nothing she could say would change what was coming. Nothing she could promise would undo the betrayal I'd witnessed at the airport, and nothing she could offer would make me reconsider the path of destruction I'd carefully laid out for her and her lover. I made myself coffee using the expensive espresso machine I'd bought specifically for this place, sat down at my new dining table, and opened my laptop to check on the final phase of my plan. The part that would ensure Vanessa understood that crossing me came with consequences far beyond just losing access to money and property. My private investigator had sent his final report overnight, a comprehensive dossier on Daniel that contained everything from his credit score to his criminal record to his employment history, and the information was even more damaging than I'd hoped. Darnell had been fired from 2 previous gym jobs for inappropriate relationships with married clients, a pattern of behavior that he'd apparently perfected over the years, targeting wealthy women who were lonely or unsatisfied and seducing them with attention and physical affection that their busy husbands couldn't provide. He had debts totaling over $60,000, mostly credit cards he'd maxed out trying to maintain an appearance of success that his personal trainer's salary could never actually support. And he'd been counting on Vanessa to bail him out, to be his golden ticket to a lifestyle he could never achieve on his own merit. His parents, the sweet older couple who'd looked so happy at the airport, had a mortgage that was 3 months behind, medical bills they couldn't pay, and a daughter in college whose tuition was overdue, all problems that Darnell had promised Vanessa would solve with her wealth, essentially selling his family's financial distress as a way to manipulate her generosity. The investigator had also uncovered something particularly interesting. Darnell had another girlfriend, a 25-year-old receptionist at the gym who had no idea about Vanessa, who thought she was his only woman, who was probably sitting at home right now, wondering why her man hadn't called her since he'd gotten back from his supposed family emergency in Atlanta. I forwarded the entire report to Vanessa's phone with a simple message. This is the man you destroyed our marriage for. This is who you chose over 15 years of loyalty and partnership. I hope he was worth it. Then I sent a separate copy to Darnell's other girlfriend, along with screenshots of the text messages between him and Vanessa, because if I was going to burn Vanessa's world down, I was going to make sure Darnell's came crashing down, right alongside hers. Within minutes, my phone started ringing again, Vanessa's name flashing on the screen over and over, but I silenced it and turned my attention to the other matter I needed to handle this morning. I'd scheduled a meeting with the board of directors at Vanessa's company, the marketing firm where she worked as a senior executive, a position she'd obtained largely because of the connections I provided and the reputation I'd helped her build in Chicago's business community. She didn't know it yet, but I was a primary investor in her firm, holding 35% of the company's equity through a shell corporation, and I was about to exercise my right to call for her immediate termination based on moral turpitude and misuse of company resources, specifically the fact that she'd been using company credit cards to fund her trips with Daniel and claiming them as legitimate business expenses. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the firm's downtown office, and I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in my best suit, carrying a briefcase full of documentation that would leave the board no choice but to act. Vanessa's colleagues greeted me warmly in the lobby, having no idea why I was there, still thinking of me as the supportive husband who showed up to company events and donated generously to their office charity drives. I was escorted to the executive conference room where 5 board members were already seated, looking curious about this emergency meeting I'd called, probably expecting me to announce some new investment opportunity or partnership proposal. Instead, I opened my briefcase and distributed copies of Vanessa's credit card statements, expense reports, and the text messages where she'd explicitly discussed using company funds to finance her affair, all meticulously organized and highlighted for maximum impact. I watched their faces change as they read through the evidence, watched shock turn to anger, turn to resignation, as they realized one of their senior executives had been defrauding the company, putting their reputation at risk, exposing them to potential legal liability. The board president, a woman named Diane, who'd been Vanessa's mentor and champion, looked at me with something like pity in her eyes, probably understanding that I wasn't just here as an investor, but as a betrayed husband who was making sure Vanessa lost everything she valued, not just her marriage, but her career, her reputation, her standing in the professional community we'd both worked so hard to be part of. The vote was unanimous and swift, termination effective immediately, with the board agreeing to pursue legal action to recover the misappropriated funds and cooperate fully with any criminal investigation if I chose to press charges. Diane asked me quietly if I was sure I wanted to do this, if there wasn't some way to handle it more privately, to give Vanessa a chance to resign quietly and preserve some dignity. But I told her that dignity was something Vanessa had forfeited when she decided to parade her lover and his family through an international airport like they were some kind of prize she'd won. I left the meeting with exactly what I'd come for. Confirmation that by noon today, Vanessa would receive a termination letter and a demand for restitution, that her professional email would be deactivated, that her access to the office would be revoked, that her colleagues would be informed she was no longer with the company, and that the reputation she'd spent a decade building would be permanently tarnished by the fraud. Investigation that was now officially underway. As I walked out of that building into the cold Chicago morning, my phone buzzed with a text from my attorney, letting me know that Vanessa had just been served with divorce papers at the budget motel where she'd spent the night, and that according to the process server, she'd broken down completely when she'd read through the terms, which gave her nothing, offered her nothing, left her with nothing, except the clothes in her suitcase and the crushing weight of her own terrible decisions. The revenge is in full swing, and Vanessa's world is crumbling piece by piece. If you're loving this story of consequences and justice, hit that like button and subscribe, because Chapter 4 is going to show you just how much further this can go. Drop a comment and let me know. Should he stop here or keep going? What would you do? 3 days had passed since I'd destroyed Vanessa's life, and the fallout was even more spectacular than I'd imagined. I sat in my new apartment watching the news coverage on my laptop, a story about a prominent Chicago marketing executive being investigated for fraud. Her face pixelated, but her name mentioned enough times that everyone in our social circle would know exactly who they were talking about. My phone had been flooded with messages from mutual friends, colleagues, and business associates, all asking what had happened, expressing shock and concern. Some trying to get the inside story, while others were clearly just fishing for gossip to spread at their next dinner party. I responded to none of them, letting the silence speak for itself, letting people draw their own conclusions about why a marriage that had seemed perfect from the outside had imploded so publicly and so completely. The truth was already spreading through Chicago's business community like wildfire. Whispers about the affair, about the betrayal, about the wife who'd thrown away everything for a personal trainer. And I knew that by the end of the week, Vanessa would be persona non grata in every professional and social circle she'd ever been part of. But I wasn't satisfied yet, wasn't ready to let her fade into obscurity and rebuild somewhere else, because she needed to understand that actions had consequences. That betrayal came with a price, and that price was going to be extracted in full before I was done with her. Vanessa had tried to see me in person, showing up at my office building only to be turned away by security, leaving tear-stained notes with the front desk that I threw away without reading, sending emails that got automatically filtered into a folder I'd labeled Dead to Me and never opened. Daniel had tried to reach me too, leaving voicemails where he called me every name in the book, threatening legal action, claiming I'd ruined his life and his family's life, conveniently forgetting that he'd been the one sleeping with another man's wife and spending another man's money. His other girlfriend had apparently confronted him at the gym where he worked, causing such a scene that management had suspended him pending an investigation, and without Vanessa's money to fall back on, he was now facing eviction from his apartment and repossession of his car, the expensive BMW he bought on credit, thinking Vanessa would cover the payments. His parents had stopped calling Vanessa after they'd learned the truth about her marriage status and the source of her wealth, apparently having just enough shame to realize they'd been accessories to destroying someone's family, though I doubted that shame would last long once they started losing their house. The investigator had informed me that Vanessa had moved in with a girlfriend from college, sleeping on a couch in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she would have never even driven through before, taking the bus to job interviews that all ended the same way once potential employers Googled her name and found the fraud investigation that was now public record. I had started seeing someone new, a brilliant corporate attorney named Jasmine, who worked at a rival firm and had no connection to my past life with Vanessa. We'd met at a charity gala 2 weeks ago, one of those events I'd forced myself to attend to show the world I was moving on, that I wasn't sitting at home drowning in self-pity over my failed marriage. Jasmine was everything Vanessa was. Independent, ambitious, driven by her own success rather than looking for someone to fund her lifestyle. And most importantly, she was honest, transparent about her intentions and her expectations in a way that felt refreshing after years of Vanessa's deception. We'd been on 3 dates, kept things casual and light, and I found myself actually enjoying her company, actually laughing at her jokes, actually feeling like maybe there was life after betrayal. Maybe there was a future that didn't involve bitterness and revenge consuming every waking moment. But then Jasmine asked me if I'd really sold everything out of spite, if the rumors she'd heard were true, if I was really the kind of man who would burn down his own life just to make sure his ex-wife suffered, and I'd seen something in her eyes that looked like judgment, like she was reassessing whether I was someone worth her time. I tried to explain my side, tried to make her understand the depth of Vanessa's betrayal, but the more I talked, the more I realized how I sounded, how consumed I'd become by this need for revenge, and I wondered if maybe I'd gone too far, if maybe in my quest to make Vanessa pay, I turned myself into someone I didn't recognize. That doubt lasted exactly 48 hours until I received an envelope in the mail containing copies of text messages between Vanessa and her lawyer, messages where she plotted to claim domestic abuse, to lie to the court about violence that never happened, to fabricate evidence that would paint me as a monster and give her leverage in the divorce proceedings. She was willing to destroy my reputation completely, to accuse me of crimes I'd never committed, to turn me into a villain in the eyes of the law and the public, all because she couldn't accept that she'd lost, that her betrayal had consequences, that she didn't get to walk away from this with anything except the shame she'd earned. The messages detailed a strategy to get a restraining order based on false allegations, to freeze whatever assets I had left, to drag me through a criminal investigation that would cost me hundreds of thousands in legal fees, even if the charges were eventually dropped. My hands shook as I read through her planned testimony. Descriptions of abuse that never happened, incidents that were completely fabricated, a timeline of violence that existed only in her desperate imagination. She was going to claim I'd been controlling and abusive throughout our marriage, that she'd been afraid of me, that the affair with Darnell had been her way of escaping my tyranny, and she had coaching from her lawyer on how to cry on cue, how to appear vulnerable and traumatized, how to make a judge believe her lies even without a shred of actual evidence. The woman I'd loved for 15 years, the woman I'd built an empire with and shared every dream with, was now willing to destroy me completely just to salvage some financial security from the wreckage of her own terrible choices. I called my attorney immediately, my voice cold with a rage that went beyond anything I'd felt before. Because this wasn't just about money or property anymore. This was about Vanessa trying to paint me as an abuser, trying to turn my justice into her victimhood, trying to twist the narrative so completely that she became the wronged party instead of the cheating wife who'd thrown away everything for a personal trainer with a six-pack and a mountain of debt. My lawyer listened to everything, asked me to send copies of the messages, and then told me something that made me smile for the first time in days. Filing false abuse allegations was a crime. Conspiring with her attorney to present fabricated evidence was grounds for disbarment. And if we could prove she'd planned this maliciously, we could not only defend against her claims, but potentially pursue criminal charges against both her and her lawyer for attempted fraud against the court. He told me to sit tight, to let them make the first move, to let Vanessa walk into court and present her lies under oath, and then would drop the evidence of her conspiracy like a nuclear bomb, destroying not just her case, but any shred of credibility she had left. I hung up the phone feeling something shift inside me, feeling the last traces of doubt or mercy evaporate completely, because Vanessa had just shown me that she would stop at nothing, lie about anything, destroy anyone who stood in her way, and that meant I was completely justified in making sure she lost everything, suffered completely, and regretted every single choice that had led her to this moment. This is getting intense, and we're heading into the final chapter where everything comes to a head. If you want to see how this story ends and whether Vanessa faces the ultimate consequences, you need to subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Comment below and tell me what you think is going to happen next. Will justice be served? Drop your predictions and I'll see you in the final chapter. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers who'd heard about the high-profile divorce case that had dominated Chicago's social circles for the past month. I sat at the defendant's table with my legal team, 3 of the best attorneys money could buy, watching as Vanessa entered through the side door with her lawyer, a sleazy-looking man named Richard, who specialized in representing scorned spouses and had a reputation for winning cases through manipulation and sympathy rather than actual facts. Full stop. Vanessa looked terrible. Her designer clothes replaced by a modest dress clearly chosen to make her appear vulnerable and sympathetic. Her hair pulled back in a simple style, her face free of the expensive makeup she used to wear, dark circles under her eyes that could have been from genuine stress or could have been carefully applied to enhance her victim narrative. She didn't look at me as she took her seat, keeping her gaze down in a performance of trauma that might have worked on someone who didn't know the truth, who hadn't read her text messages, plotting this entire charade, who didn't understand that every tear she was about to shed would be calculated for maximum effect on the judge. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Patricia Morrison entered, a no-nonsense black woman in her 60s, who had a reputation for seeing through deception and ruling based on evidence rather than emotion, which was exactly why my attorneys had hoped to get her assigned to this case. Vanessa's lawyer stood up and began his opening statement, painting a picture of an abusive marriage where his client had been controlled, isolated, and terrorized by a wealthy husband who used his money and power to dominate every aspect of her life. He described incidents that never happened, quoted things I never said, created a timeline of escalating violence that existed only in the fictional narrative he and Vanessa had constructed together. He told the court that Vanessa had been forced to seek comfort outside her marriage because she was afraid for her safety, that her relationship with Daniel had been a desperate attempt to find someone who would treat her with kindness and respect, that my discovery of the affair had triggered a vindictive campaign of financial abuse designed to leave her destitute and dependent. Richard presented photographs of Vanessa looking distressed, though I recognized most of them as being from before we were even married, from times when she'd been stressed about work or worried about her mother's health, images taken completely out of context and repurposed to support a lie. He showed the court bank statements, highlighting the liquidated assets, the sold properties, the emptied accounts, using my justified response to her betrayal as evidence of my supposed cruelty and contrition. He called character witnesses who testified that they'd seen Vanessa become withdrawn and anxious over the years, people who'd interpreted her guilt and secretiveness about the affair as signs of abuse rather than what they actually were, the behavior of someone living a double life and terrified of getting caught. Then it was my attorney's turn, and she stood up with a calm confidence that made several people in the courtroom lean forward in anticipation. She began by acknowledging that, yes, I had liquidated our assets. Yes, I had sold our properties. Yes, I had taken aggressive financial action in response to discovering my wife's infidelity. But then, she asked the judge a simple question. Was a betrayed spouse entitled to protect their assets from someone who had been systematically stealing from joint accounts to fund an extramarital affair? She presented evidence that Vanessa had transferred over $200,000 from her joint accounts to Daniel and his family over the course of 18 months, payments disguised as charitable donations or business expenses, but actually going to cover his debts, his parents' bills, his car payments, his lifestyle. She showed the court the text messages between Vanessa and Daniel, where they discussed their future plans, their intention to divorce me and live off my wealth, their callous dismissal of my feelings, and my contributions to our marriage. She presented the investigator's report on Daniel, his pattern of targeting married wealthy women, his other girlfriend, his fraudulent promises to Vanessa that had been motivated entirely by financial gain. She showed receipts for the Dubai trip, proving that Vanessa had used company credit cards to fund what was clearly a personal vacation, establishing her pattern of financial dishonesty that extended beyond just our marriage. And then, when the courtroom was already buzzing with whispers about how dramatically different the reality was from the story Vanessa had tried to sell, my attorney pulled out her final piece of evidence, the text messages between Vanessa and her lawyer, the ones where they plotted to fabricate abuse allegations, coached each other on testimony, discussed how to manipulate the court into believing lies. The judge's face hardened as she read through the messages, and I watched Vanessa's composure finally crack completely as she realized what was happening, as she understood that her last desperate gambit had been exposed, that her lies were now part of the public record. Richard tried to object, tried to claim the messages were obtained illegally, but my attorney calmly explained that they'd been voluntarily provided by a paralegal in Richard's office, who'd been horrified by the conspiracy she'd witnessed and had contacted us out of ethical obligation. Judge Morrison called both attorneys to the bench for a sidebar that lasted 10 minutes, and when they returned, Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years, while my attorney had the faint smile of someone who just won a complete victory. The judge announced that she was suspending the proceedings to refer the matter of potential perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud to the district attorney's office, that she was ordering an immediate investigation into Richard's conduct and would be forwarding her findings to the State Bar Association, and that based on the evidence presented, she was granting my petition for divorce with no financial settlements to Vanessa, who would also be responsible for my legal fees given her documented fraud and attempted manipulation of the court. Vanessa collapsed in her chair, sobbing openly now with real tears instead of the fake ones she'd planned to deploy, while Richard gathered his papers with shaking hands, probably already contemplating the end of his legal career. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps, journalists scrambling to type up their stories, spectators pulling out their phones to spread the news that the fraud had been exposed in the most dramatic way possible. I walked out of that courtroom a free man, legally untethered from the woman who'd betrayed me, vindicated in the eyes of the law and public opinion, my reputation intact while Vanessa's lay in ruins at her own feet. My attorney informed me that the district attorney was indeed pursuing charges against both Vanessa and Richard, that they were looking at potential jail time for conspiracy to commit perjury, that Vanessa's fraud investigation at her former company was also yielding criminal charges, and that by the time all the legal proceedings were finished, she would likely be facing years of probation, if not actual prison time. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in the cold February air, feeling lighter than I had in months, feeling like justice had actually been served, like the universe had finally balanced the scales. Jasmine called to congratulate me, having watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom, and asked if I wanted to have dinner to celebrate. Her earlier doubts about me apparently resolved now that she'd seen the full picture of what Vanessa had done and tried to do. I said yes because I was ready to move forward, ready to build a new life with someone who valued honesty and integrity, ready to leave Vanessa in the past where she belonged. 6 months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Vanessa had pleaded guilty to fraud charges and received 2 years probation plus restitution payments she'd be making for the rest of her life. That Daniel had moved back in with his parents after losing everything that they'd broken up within weeks of the trial after he'd realized she had nothing left to offer him. She'd tried to reach out one last time, a handwritten letter that arrived at my office, filled with apologies and regrets and pleas for forgiveness that I read once and then burned. Because some betrayals don't deserve second chances, some mistakes can't be forgiven, and some people need to live with the consequences of their choices for the rest of their lives. I was thriving in my new life, my business expanding into new markets, my relationship with Jasmine growing stronger every day, my happiness no longer dependent on someone who'd proven they didn't deserve my trust or my love. The billionaire wife who'd returned from a trip with her lover and his family had discovered that her husband had sold all their assets. But more importantly, she discovered that actions have consequences. That betrayal comes with a price, and that some revenge is best served cold, calculated, and absolutely final. And that's how the story ends, with justice served and a fresh start earned. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling me what you think about how everything played out. Was this the perfect revenge, or would you have done something different? Thank you for sticking with me through all 5 chapters. Your support means everything, and I'll see you in the next story. Peace.